Welcome to C2G Talk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Maarten Van Aalst, who for the past 17 years has led the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, but is now poised to be Director General and Chief Science Officer of the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute. He will be speaking in his personal capacity on the issues we're to discuss today. The Climate Centre's mission is to help the movement and its partners reduce the impacts of climate change and extreme weather events on vulnerable people, bringing the best global scientific insights to the local level through dialogues and pioneering communications techniques. Mr. Van Aalst is also the Princess Margriet Chair in Climate and Disaster Resilience at the University of Twente and a coordinating lead author in Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Working Group 2, on key risks. So Maarten Van Aalst, welcome to C2G Talk.
Pleasure, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Well, we're now at around 1.2 degrees of global warming above the pre-industrial average, and the trend remains upwards. What impact is this having on the prevalence of humanitarian crises around the world, and what do you see to be the trends moving forwards?
Well, I could refer either to what we're seeing around the world in practice, and many volunteers on the front lines of those rising risks reporting that they're responding to more events, also events that they haven't seen before. I could indeed also refer to the IPCC, which in the last assessment indeed confirmed, also in the summary for policymakers, that we are already seeing these humanitarian impacts of climate change. With a side note also that's particularly in cases of high vulnerability. So that is something to note here, and where I think the realization has also changed over the years. So where previously people would say contexts of high vulnerability, where people are already at the edges of tolerance for even normal climate variability, right, are places where climate probably doesn't matter so much because people are worried about other things. What we're seeing now is that actually those are the places we should be most worried about climate change because it pushes people over the edge much more quickly. And that is basically what we're seeing both in practice and in the science. So
you've seen a shift in the way humanitarian aid agencies approach the topic of climate change?
Oh, definitely. It's gone from being actually in some ways seen as a risky topic because it was seen as politically divisive. And one of the hallmarks of humanitarian work is, of course, to be politically neutral. So it was seen originally as, an environmental topic that was associated with particular parts of the political spectrum. Now it's moved to one of the top priorities in lots of the day-to-day work. Certainly all the work having to do with disasters triggered by natural hazards, but increasingly also in conflicts of conflict, where we also see that double whammy in a way of high vulnerability due to the other circumstances people are already facing, and then the climate risks that come on top of that.
So how has the Red Crescent Climate Centre helped countries and people and communities tackle these impacts?
Well, we always see ourselves as a bridge between science, policy, and practice. So 20 years ago, the question was even asked in a very general sense, also under the Geneva Conventions. So the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, all the national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, the IFRC, the ICRC, but all the states that are parties to the Geneva Conventions. Should we be worried about the potential humanitarian consequences of climate change? That's how it was phrased then. So our initial work was to look at that time at the IPCC third assessment report and interpret it in terms of what those humanitarian consequences might be. And we found that there were primarily many questions. So, and of course, rising uncertainty partly means rising risks. It partly also means homework to do in terms of understanding what was coming our way. So we've worked with the scientific community to get more of those questions properly articulated and then addressed. The IPCC special report on extremes in 2012 was a very important element in that as well. That then also led to a different realization in policy. So for instance, the growing together of adaptation to climate change, which was long seen as an adjustment to gradual long-term trends in risk, big patterns, gradual sea level rise, to a realization that that's actually very close to what humanitarians have been calling disaster risk reduction, dealing with changing extremes. and also tackling not only those extremes from the perspective of the shift in the hazard due to the climate extreme, but also the elements of exposure and vulnerability. Who is affected by what's changing, and why are they vulnerable? And of course, that also puts attention to issues of equity, where we see the poorest countries being hit hardest. That then also brings it to our work in practice, and I think that's 80% of what we do day to day. It's answering questions of people in the field who are confronted with changing conditions and ask the question: is that climate change? Should we be preparing for more of that? But part of it is also then integrating what science brings to the table that also allows us to improve our humanitarian work in the day-to-day practice. And an important example of that is that in the more volatile climate we face nowadays, a critical asset we have in a way is seeing extreme events coming also at shorter timescales. So a season ahead, or even a couple of days or hours ahead. Some of the biggest success stories in the past decades in humanitarian aid have been the development of good early warning systems, particularly on the back of better meteorological observations and forecasting, but then particularly making sure we reach the last mile to local communities and we build the shelters so that they have a safe place to go when those warnings arrive. So all of that has led to better saving of lives. That's being scaled up. But we were very hampered by the fact that the humanitarian funding still arrived only after the events had happened.
Right.
And we know from many calculations from our own humanitarian work, but also from calculations of institutions like the World Bank, for instance, that we get a much bigger bang for our buck, but also much more impact in terms of avoiding suffering if we can spend that money before the disaster happens, both in long-term risk reduction, but also even in those hours and days before the disaster happens. So we've invested a lot in something called forecast-based financing. And that whole field of anticipatory action has now really become a branch of humanitarian work, where also the big funding instruments in the humanitarian world enable allocation of finance based on credible scientific evidence, but ahead of the actual event, allowing us to be more effective. So those sorts of examples are I think, a sense of the adaptation in a way that is happening in the humanitarian system, being confronted with ever-rising risks.
So speaking of sources of funding, there was the recent COP27 UN Climate Summit. Responses to its results have been mixed, not enough progress on mitigation, but there was some celebration of at least the principle of setting up a new fund on loss and damage, perhaps some progress on adaptation. I was wondering if you could give a sense of how you viewed the outcome of that meeting, and what are some of the things that are going to be able to happen over the next year or two as a result of it?
Well, I'd share that very double feeling that you're expressing there. I think it's been trying to play catch up with the goals that the global community has set so clearly already in Paris, and reaffirmed even with greater urgency and stricter margins last year in Glasgow. The science of the latest IPCC cycle is very clear that we have no wiggle room. We have to stick with those ambitions, but we're not delivering on them. And in that sense, I think Sharm el-Sheikh, frankly, has not delivered the implementation COP that people were calling for, the practical progress to go much faster in the transitions that we need to be going through. And that is clear on the mitigation side. It also applies to adaptation and adaptation finance. There are important discussions happening about scaling up adaptation finance, but also making sure it reaches more of the most vulnerable communities that are hit hardest, but often not reached with that climate finance. I think important discussions now on loss and damage. The fund establishment is I think, a sign of the whole world, not just in a political sense, but also in an individual sense, in terms of almost everyone I speak to around the world, having seen the weather around them change. So a realization that we're in this changed climate already, and having to come to grips with the equality aspects of that, but also recognizing that we're at risk of seeing the impacts shape future vulnerability. So if we don't manage to deal with the impacts we're already facing today, that itself will hamper our ability to tackle what is still coming our way, which will be worse than what we're already facing today. And that is something in terms of the overall architecture of the Paris Agreement we have to come to grips with. It's a global problem that needs everyone to tackle the mitigation challenge, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. That means that we need solidarity, particularly helping poorer countries adapt, but also allowing them to deal with the blows they're already getting today. Now, doing that effectively, I think, is going to be, there was talk of the mosaic approach, rather than just counting on this one fund to solve it all. And I think that's been the same on adaptation.
Right.
I think it was naive maybe in the beginning to think that only the adaptation funds were going to solve all our adaptation problems. That's also not how they have evolved. There's still a lack of financing. It's not reaching the right places, but we are seeing a diversity of approaches there. And I think you'll see that on loss and damage as well.
So, sorry, can you explain a little bit more? What is the mosaic approach?
So it's basically saying the call for a fund on loss and damage was symbolically, politically a very important one, because it recognizes the collective responsibility for some of the impacts, particularly already hitting the poorest countries. How exactly the responsibility to pay into the fund is going to be distributed still needs to be negotiated. How who gets access to the fund for what type of impact still needs to be negotiated, but the principle is established, and that was a very important step. At the same time, I think it'd be naive to assume that this one fund is then going to deal with all of the impacts. And we have a number of existing mechanisms already that are dealing with some of those impacts already. And the humanitarian system is one of them.
Yes.
But we've been very clear, don't just rely on us to solve this problem. If anything, we need other approaches alongside us to take away some of the burden that, frankly, we're currently not meeting the needs. And I think the other mechanisms that would be part of that mosaic include the development banks, which are already, they've been set up in a way after Second World War to cope with the impacts of that shock and help countries rebuild their economies. They're doing that also for disasters triggered by natural hazards. They do it after other economic shocks, countries after COVID, etc. So that'd be another example.
And we are potentially seeing some change at the level of the World Bank and the IFIs, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So just to complete the mosaic, other examples would be at the international level. You could have insurance, and you could also have that at the national and subnational level. Social protection has been talked about as a mechanism by which this dealing with shocks can be strengthened. And we know we've got gaps in all kinds of places in that mosaic. So it's also identifying those gaps and figuring out how to strengthen those mechanisms, or to plug gaps with that additional fund that now needs to be established. So we've got a lot of homework on our plates. And for humanitarians, it's primarily making sure that the gaps that we see that aren't being addressed are brought to the fore. And indeed, there is a collective sense of responsibility to plug those. You were hinting at the development banks and the IFI reform. I think that might be the biggest glimmer of hope in a way coming out of the COP. Not a huge sort of formal decision on the part of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but I think a collective realization that the agenda that Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, put forward, this Bridgetown agenda, to have a discussion about whether the old Bretton Woods architecture that was set up after the Second World War is serving us well to tackle the climate crisis. That discussion is certainly being picked up right now. And that extends, I think, all the way from enabling that financial architecture to do the energy transition, but also all the way to the instruments that we have to deal with loss and damage.
So I know this is a tricky one to answer, but is it possible to give a sense of the amount of money in total we're looking at? If we just think of one example, Pakistan and its devastating floods this year, the enormity of response to that one crisis in one country over one period is so large, it begins to dwarf the sort of amounts of money that we're talking about in various pots that we've seen so far. Can you give a sense of how much more money is going to be needed throughout the system to deal with sort of adaptation and loss and damage?
I wouldn't put a number on it. The IPCC has also shied away from that because the level of confidence on one number would be exceedingly low. The one thing we can be very confident about, it is orders of magnitude more than the sort of money going around now, and also certainly one order of magnitude more than the 100 billion a year that has been promised so far under the Paris Agreement. So we're dealing with very substantial flows of money, which again also means that we need to be efficient addressing those and figuring out how to channel that money, probably through a variety of sources. It's not going to be an easy one that we can sort of do on the side of other things. These are all fundamental questions that relate to the shape of our economic architecture, our global political architecture. So they're the big questions for the coming years.
So if I could turn to one of the issues that C2G has been looking at over the past few years, obviously, given the lack of mitigation and the challenges that you've been outlining, we've seen something of an increase in interest in the idea of this approach called solar radiation modification, the idea that it might be possible to reflect a portion of incoming sunlight back into space in order to lower temperatures and reduce risk. But of course, these approaches bring new risks of their own in terms of different impacts at different parts of the world in different regions and many other potential risks. You've been looking at these ideas for a while. What are your sort of overarching thoughts on this idea of solar radiation modification? And just to reiterate, you're speaking in your personal capacity on this issue.
Yeah, thanks. And I would say that even on a personal level, it's a struggle in a way. I was concerned when I first heard about it, about the huge uncertainties that would be involved with applying such techniques at the global scale. I also got concerned that they might be applied much more quickly than might be a good idea, given that some of them are actually remarkably cheap compared to some of the costs that we were just discussing and the transitions that the world needs to go through. So I sensed a risk that these technologies would be developed and then applied hazardously too quickly without taking full account of all those risks. At the same time, over the past couple of years, I've seen that we're basically failing on the other fronts. And I think that leads to sort of two observations. The one is we really can't afford to see these new technologies as an easy way out. The risks are very high and there's massive gaps in our knowledge. And to some extent, there are gaps in our knowledge, for instance, relating to the impacts of those new risks that we might create on the most vulnerable countries and people. To some extent, there are also more fundamental risks that also won't go away with doing more research, especially on those areas. They're related to the big uncertainties we've got in the climate system. And we've got only one experiment to play with. And there's no way of capturing all the uncertainty. We can make it smaller, but we won't be able to make it go away. In that context of those very high uncertainties, my initial concern was, let's not even go there, and let's also take away the risk that we would be taking energy away from the extreme urgent need to do mitigation, and then where we're failing on that to do adaptation, where there's also still an immense amount of work to be done that we know can be extremely effective reducing risks. But then again, if we would enter, if we would continue to fail, but also if we would then, again, speaking of those same uncertainties, they all apply to some extent also to global warming itself. If we would get into the runaway climate change scenarios that are getting increasingly likely already today, but certainly if we would enter the territory above, say, 1.5 degrees global warming, then at some point we may need it. And I find myself also seeing it very difficult to justify not to at least consider these options much more seriously and have the discussions about how we would govern them. And I think that is the main message, maybe, I think in line with the discussions that you've been organizing. We need to get our heads around how we then weigh those risks and how we get everyone with a stake in the decisions, the difficult decisions that would then need to be made at the table and with a proper voice.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack in that answer. So many key issues surrounding the consideration and governance of SRM. Perhaps I'll just sort of pick a couple of them, tease out a couple of the issues. Number one, you referred to research, what it could, but also the limits of what it can achieve, as it were. Do you support more research in this field at the moment? There's a bit of an active debate going on. We're certainly seeing some efforts to promote more research, but at the same time, a growing set of voices saying, no, we can't go down this route. But broadly, is your instinct that more research is needed, or that there should not be more research?
I'd say I'm somewhere in the middle. I understand both perspectives. So as noted, one of the concerns about deploying solar radiation modification would be that it could trigger all kinds of side effects. And in order to reduce that uncertainty, we'll need to know more, right? At the same time, spending significant amount of research money on this line of climate intervention will take some research money away from other areas where we also really have big research questions still to address. And in addition, and that's a bit the moral hazard, it starts sending the signal that we've got an escape route here, and that's a way out, which by itself could have an impact on the broader climate debates. And I think the primary message at this point is that with the little we know, it looks like a very dangerous escape route. So, let's not count on it. But then again, if there is that risk that we'll need that escape route, I'd rather make it safer. So that's where I see the case for research. In order to make it safer, I think the research would need to be focused on the areas where those risks are highest. And I think the tendency at the moment is to focus the research primarily on the technology side. So, what sort of technical mechanisms do we have and how would they play out? I think we need to have a much better chain to the impact and a much bigger voice also of researchers in the areas that might be most affected and where the voice currently is weakest. So I do worry about, if there is big research investment, the balance in that and the assurances about how even the research is being governed, but also voices are being strengthened for everyone to be at the table.
And I'll definitely come back to that one in a second, because it's very important. Just quickly back to the issue of moral hazard, or this risk that even just talking about this, let alone potentially deploying it, could lessen the energy. Do you see that is actually something happening in any way in practice? In the sense that, does it take this SRM to be the thing that stops people putting the requisite effort into mitigation? Or is that actually happening? Or are we seeing, quite frankly, other aspects of economic and political kind of life stopping sufficient action and mitigation that really has very little to do with SRM? I'm trying to calibrate how big this moral hazard effect is, seeing as it's such a fundamental concern for so many people.
Yeah, the honest answer is I don't know. I definitely think the major drivers why mitigation isn't happening as quickly as it should are different. It's not that SRM at the moment is the big impediment. But then again, the message on mitigation is also we need to chip away at it at every single aspect, right? In every single sector, looking at multiple interventions in a very systemic way across all our societies. So I also don't buy the argument if SRM only takes a bit of the attention away from mitigation, then why worry about it? I think mitigation needs attention on all of those fronts all the time. So we can't afford to let go of any one of those slivers. More fundamentally, I think your question about, do we see that driver existing at all, or is it also possibly even playing out the other way? I see both, frankly, and I can't quantify how big the impacts are. So I see people, like in public lectures, for instance, right, to a range of audiences. The Red Cross is actually also a very wide constituency of people, very much a cross-cut of society. I don't, at the moment, make solar radiation modification a big element of my presentations, but it's sometimes a slide somewhere toward the end saying, and by the way, so my presentation would usually be, we've sort of moved from seeing climate change only as a long-term environmental problem, dealing with these greenhouse gases, understanding whether the greenhouse gases are to blame, but then doing something about them.
Yeah.
To one also of recognizing that the climate is already changing and we need to come to grips with that. So adaptation. To one, we're also realizing we're basically not doing enough on both of those fronts, and we're dealing with the consequences already, the losses and damages. And then I sometimes make a remark, and some discussions are already appearing, even about whether we can fix the climate. So that would be the solar radiation modification element. If I do that, in quite a few of the talks, I would get the reaction, oh my God, is it that serious? Are we really considering those sorts of interventions? That means we need to get much more serious about mitigation. So it sometimes actually motivates people to do more on mitigation rather than the other way around. I also see the other effect. And well, I don't know if that's worryingly, but to me, to some extent, maybe in terms of that potential drain of energy away from the focus on mitigation, among students, for instance, I sometimes see this, including technology students in particular, who feel like, you know, that whole climate talk shop has been going on for so long, and we've had our climate marches, and we've had these, you know, how many years of international negotiations, and we've had the film stars saying this is so important and we need to do something about it, and we've got all the greenwashing by the big companies, and we're not succeeding. Ideally, we want young technology-driven students to say, so I'm going to make it my life's work to contribute to that shift. But I see some of them saying, well, that's just morass of basically too little, too late progress. And also many people already in that space and apparently not doing what the world needs. Now, here, this new thing, you know, that exciting new technology where something drastic new could happen that could actually fix this problem. That sounds exciting. And that worries me to some extent, if you see what I mean. Because I think we need all that energy of those bright young people to tackle the problem at the root cause.
So I wanted to touch on this sort of issue of how you go about assessing risks, and of essentially what we're looking at is the risks of SRM and measuring that against the risks of a hotter world without SRM. Those risks felt in various different ways, perhaps on health, perhaps on agriculture, all sorts of different kind of metrics by which you can feel risk. And of course, these are going to be felt differently in different parts of the world. Even within countries, different regions will have quite different impacts. So you end up with a bewildering array of different risks from different things measured in different ways, according also, incidentally, according to different, perhaps moral and ethical systems. People will feel risk differently depending on how they assess that. How does one even begin to go about creating a matrix, putting the risks of SRM on one side against the risks of hotter world without SRM on another, adding up to some sort of governance decision process that can lead to decisions about, you know, whether or not to deploy? I'm interested. It seems very complicated to me.
Yeah, it is, and in a way, it already is for mitigation as well, right? So people are often asking IPCC Working Group 2, so the one dealing with impacts and adaptation, just give us how much climate change will cost at a certain level of warming, and then we'll see how much mitigation costs for the marginal warming that we avoid, and it will sort of optimize, and we'll just do the calculation, and that tells us which measures we deploy, and then we get an economically optimal outcome. And of course, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that in the sense that we've got huge differences around the world, different making systems colliding, but also different types of impacts that people also value differently. I mean, even the value of a human life, right, is difficult. The loss of ecosystems or the loss of cultures, how do you value those? And that's already a problem with climate change itself. It will be equally difficult or more difficult even if you add that second layer. There is a risk, and I think we've seen some of that with some mitigation, but also adaptation choices, that if you don't pay attention, especially to those dimensions, the non-economic losses, but also the economic losses facing vulnerable groups, that the choices will be made to first order, looking at the biggest interests, you know, the people with the power and the money, the people that might be making the decisions about the deployment of SRM, for instance, who will do back of the envelope calculations possibly, but tuned primarily to the impacts they are most concerned about. And we're seeing this in adaptation, for instance, regarding water management. You know, the decisions that are made about allocation of water, but also protection against too much water. There are very clear trade-offs. There are winners and losers, and you already see some groups losing out. So at least figuring out processes by which that voice is strong enough for the decision to do justice to everyone's impacts would be important. A really important element of that then is also to have mechanisms by which people, well, first of all, can be to some extent part of the discussion. But of course, if there are winners and losers, we may also, I mean, in a way, we're already making suboptimal choices in the world right now. So you may also be confronted with governance choices that are not going to be to everyone's liking, but then you need to ensure that you properly compensate people that would be affected.
Can I unpick a couple of those things then?
Sure.
First of all, in terms of governance fora at the international level, what fora would most be appropriate and most able, in effect, to bring in all these different voices and maybe deal with some of the power dynamics that could come at the expense of equity and inclusion? So I'm interested, where do you think these discussions could be usefully had? Do those places already exist, need to be perhaps updated and reformed, or are new places needed?
Well, I think that the places exist in theory, but they also already struggle in practice, right? So I think that the first place you would go to is the UNFCCC, which already holds it's one place where all countries come together, and you've got all these different elements of the global climate challenge in one package in a way, and also interacting with each other to some extent. But we also know it's struggling basically to meet the world's needs in terms of decision making. I'd say the national decision making below that is a very important element of it, but in terms of the negative impacts that would also be felt at the global level, we would really struggle. So strengthening the UNFCCC would be the ideal solution. Whether that's an easy one to do, I'm struggling to see, especially also with the current geopolitics, how you could do that quickly. But I think you would need to invest in it for sure. The other side of it is that I think that the broader climate community around it, so the scientific community organizing itself, like in the IPCC, the whole climate sort of, well, what's the right word for it? But basically the whole climate discussions in societies around the world, including yes, companies, both companies with vested interests that maybe are not eager to see a very aggressive climate policy, but also companies that are inventing the new technologies that want to see certain regulations go faster. But also NGOs with a range of different concerns that they're representing, but also youth movements, artists, all of those coming to the table. I think you'd want that whole community in a way also to start coming to grips with some of these questions.
And perhaps I can
the diversity of voices.
Dig into that. And this question itself that I'm about to ask could be the subject of a much longer talk just by itself. But I know that you and your colleagues have pioneered a lot of sort of participative communications techniques to help involve local communities in different parts of the world, actually get to grips with what is the challenge, what are the issues, and how do we go about tackling them, and then to some degree helping to feed that back into national and international decision-making processes. What kind of lessons have you learned about that, especially in an environment where trust is limited, we have an infodemic, people are not sure what sources to turn to, and if there were ever that sort of level of consultation in SRM, one can only imagine the amount of mistrust that there might be there. What kind of lessons from your experience would you bring to helping bring that discussion to a much more sort of a lower participative level?
Well, the first is you need to really invest in making that work. And I mean, the example I mentioned earlier about the reform of humanitarian financing is a good example, maybe. I mean, that's also, in the end, there's donor agencies with a political mandate to support people after a disaster has resulted in human suffering. That are now suddenly being asked to do something different that's not within, the laws that they've been given by Parliament that allow them to support humanitarian agencies, in this case, to alleviate humanitarian suffering. We're suddenly asking them to do something differently that they cannot do. But in a way that also then, needs to activate all these systems. In the end, it's not the donor that is implementing the action before the disaster. It is the local community volunteer who needs to get a cue from their national meteorological service. So you need to have the governments in those countries and the early warnings they provide in that loop. So it's a mix of all these kinds of actors. You're never going to get there if you just make a case, for instance, writing an academic paper that shows that it's more cost effective to do things before the fact, right? So it's partly confronting people with the failings of current decision-making systems, and that we actually need to overcome some barriers to be able to find each other and to discuss whether we can do things differently. And so it takes effort to bring those people together, first of all. It does take scientific evidence to inform the discussions that they need to have, but the design of how you have the discussion also makes a big difference. So I would argue that part of the humanitarian reform on this, what we're calling forecast-based financing, so enable forecasts to trigger release of humanitarian support to alleviate suffering before an event has happened. The gains that we've designed at that time to facilitate decision makers in local communities deciding whether or not they take certain early actions when a forecast arrives, whether that's worth it, but also the donor agencies confronted with the monetary implications even of whether or not they allow the flexibility to spend money beforehand. Playing that out literally with dice and beams in a workshop session had a massive impact in the change in mindset, and allowed people to understand each other better and understand the complexities, but also the trade-offs that they were facing in allocation of resources. Now that's in a way an easy case, because in that sense, there was just a system transformation that needed to happen, but it was clear that that was going to be a beneficial one. In the case of SRM, you're dealing with a potential system transition where you've got many more unknowns. So that makes it harder, but I think even more important to invest in the right ways to facilitate those discussions.
There's so much more we could talk about with this, but we're obviously coming to the end of this talk. Perhaps I could turn to a couple of more personal things. One I just wanted to touch on, you mentioned a couple of times, sort of, as it were, the goal of reducing suffering, that perhaps being the ultimate measure of whether what we're doing is right or wrong. And that's certainly a very powerful motivator. At the same time, it might not be the primary ethical concern of all people. So there's perhaps more even a utilitarian, how do we reduce the most suffering for the most people? And some people would just have more of an idea that some things are just right and wrong. SRM is playing God, therefore wrong. And so how do you find when you come with your essentially your sense of moral guidance, which is around reducing suffering, how do you then make a connection with other people who have a slightly different, perhaps, way of judging whether something is ethical or not, a more deontological Kant type approach of just these are lines in the sand? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think you need to have space for conversations between people with different ethical backgrounds, and also make those considerations explicit to be able to understand and respect each other's perspectives on that. And I've learned a lot. I mean, I came from hard science when I entered the Red Cross world. And that's a world, for instance, where we're providing humanitarian aid in contexts of conflict, where it means we talk to both parties in a war to have access to those areas, sometimes with violent conflict happening almost at the same time. I mean, there might be a short ceasefire so that we can enter those areas. And it sometimes means compromises that from a purely ethical perspective, I don't want to talk to those guys, they're shooting each other. But yet we want to reach those people. So yes, we do talk to those people, and we sometimes, find solutions that work in that context to do the humanitarian support that's needed, but that you might not, not prefer in a purely random ethical perspective. So there are very strict humanitarian drivers that dictate in a way how you position yourself there. And I've learned a lot from that ethics, but also about the importance of explaining that ethics when I explain the trade-offs that we face in those areas, and also the limits that we then put on ourselves sometimes, also in terms of, for instance, being vocal about some issues, right? even being vocal in the initial stages about climate change. You know, if being very vocal about climate change might make the Red Cross being perceived as a political actor that could not be trusted as a neutral intermediary in a conflict, then it would not be worth it to talk about climate, right? That prerogative of being able to access those areas would be more important. So that's maybe an illustration of where I think there are horses for courses and different ethical perspectives that matter in certain contexts and also for certain actors. But it is really important that we're explicit about them and that we are able to have conversations about them. And I think in the case of SRM, that includes discussions that need to be had at all levels between people from very different political backgrounds, but indeed also with very different ethical perspectives. And we're already seeing that in some of the discussions about field experiments on SRM, where certain religious feelings, for instance, are coming to the fore. And there's a whole ethical literature also on how you deal with those principled objectives for a much wider range of political decisions. And I think we have to confront that practice of respecting all those different perspectives in how we set up governance for SRM.
Maybe if I could just finish on a note, for many professionals, as you begin to realize the extent and depth of the crisis, it can be quite hard to maintain a sense of hope and motivation, especially when you see outcomes like, oh, the world is just not doing what it needs to do. How do you personally maintain some sense of hope and motivation while not slipping into hopium, as the expression goes, like pretending we've got this, continuing to recognize the severity of the crisis, but still keep going? What philosophies do you turn to? What practices do you turn to keep that sense of motivation?
Well, I think at heart, I'm an optimist, and I have seen people be remarkably resilient in very dire circumstances. So I don't give up easily. And that's maybe also the broader mission that I've internalized with my work in the Red Cross Red Crescent over the past almost 2 decades now. There's always an opportunity to make things better, even if things are extremely dire. And you know, giving up would be the worst we can do, especially if it gets really bad. So yeah, there's always a little bit of light somewhere, and it's even more important that we get it to the darkest places.
Maarten Van Aalst, thank you so much for joining us on C2G Talk.
Pleasure.